This is a virtual event series hosted by On Its Axis and Hana House. On Its Axis is an innovation consulting firm based in Southern California, and Hana House is a flexible co-working space and cafe with locations in Palo Alto and Newport Beach. Hana House offers pay-by-the-hour workspace reservations, which is unique to the co-working world. There is no membership required and can be used by anyone at your own convenience. We are also partnered with Blue Bottle Coffee in our space. Due to the pandemic, we were closed for over a year, but we have officially reopened. We're so happy to welcome guests back into both of our locations. We have also increased our sanitation protocols and safety standards to ensure an enhanced workspace experience. If you are in the Bay Area or Orange County, feel free to stop by and check out hanahouse.com to reserve a space and learn more about our seating options, prices, and more. For today's session, I encourage you all to interact by asking questions and using the chat feature. Let's all start off by sharing where you're tuning in from. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel within the next week. Now, I would like to invite our moderator, Kelly, from On Its Axis to guide us through today's wonderful panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Marcy, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us today. I am thrilled to be taking part in this month's conversation around integrated innovation, and a particular passion of mine is employee development and building workforce culture through investing in internal teams. I'm a big believer that the people who work for and with an organization towards their objectives are the leading driver of organizational success. And I am thrilled to be joined by panelists that bring a wide variety of expertise and background to the conversation today. So with no further ado, really looking forward to inviting our speakers to introduce themselves to you. So Noah, beginning with you, if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your role and about your connection to employee development.
Sure. And first off, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be joining Isabel and Brandon talk about this subject. My name is Noah Warder. I'm the head of people at a company called Guusto. We are an HR tech company, so it's really exciting to be a head of people for an HR tech company. I really get to do a lot of the things that I haven't been able to do at a lot of other companies because our company sells people culture, and I get to do all that, which is really exciting. Previously, I've helped grow startups across Canada and the United States. I do consulting for startups and scale-ups, and I've also founded my own company. So I've kind of been on all sides of the executive table, whether it's building people teams or trying to build a company. Really excited to be here and talk about, employee development and employee innovation. I think it's a huge topic, especially right now, as everyone's kind of looking for that next step. I'm sure you've all seen the articles around the Great Resignation, the Great Movements, everybody's changing roles. So really excited to talk about this topic.
Thanks so much, Noah. Bringing it over to you, Isabel. If you could tell us a bit about yourself, your role.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's a pleasure being here with all of you today. My current role is the executive director of RevHub, which is a social enterprise incubator and accelerator based in Southern California. So we are working with impact entrepreneurs to build very successful companies that will also change the world eventually. So I'm really passionate about social enterprise. I have, in my background, I did a lot of marketing and business strategy, led many teams. So this topic today is very dear to my heart because I really believe that, humans are what is so unique to our lives. And I really believe that everybody brings a unique gift to this table, and how to leverage that gift and really help people thrive is something that I'm really passionate about.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Brendan.
Hi, thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone for having me. My name is Brendan Baltiera, and I'm a process improvement manager for our professional services division at a geospatial mapping company, software company called Esri over in Redlands, California. My background is a little bit different. I focus a lot more on operational improvement, Lean Six Sigma design thinking approaches to enable an organization to grow at scale. But a critical component of that, especially in the technical services space and IT, is employee development and really enabling those individuals. What I've seen over and over again throughout my career is that organizations can make a great investment in technology or have the most cutting edge operational components. But if the employees are not part of that equation and brought in early and often, a lot of times these projects can go awry. So it's become a very big passion of mine to figure out how we can make sure that as we move forward from a technical or product standpoint, our employees come along with us and help drive that. So hopefully I can help contribute here.
Hopefully everybody who's listening in the audience is as excited as I am based on these panelists and the unique perspectives that they're going to be bringing to this important conversation. We heard Brendan emphasize the value of bringing employees early and often into the conversation. We heard Noah touch on a very sensitive topic for today's corporate leadership, which is around this idea of the great resignation and the shifting workplace culture. And we heard Isabel talk about the role that employees play in bringing their unique contributions. And I think it's an important step to take a moment to think about where we are in the cycle of our workforce. Without a doubt, most experts agree that we're in a shifting workplace culture, and we're moving from industrial to knowledge and from knowledge to innovation workforce. And as we enter into today's conversation, I'm going to come first to you, Isabel, because I think an important aspect of this shift is really about the recognition of the unique contributions of employees. And I'd love, from your perspective, to hear what employee development means to you, and to ask you to provide an example of either employee development or a success story about individual contribution to organizational success.
Definitely, I'm happy to share. So for me, employee development is really a two-way street, right? And it's a collaboration and a conversation. So I always like to make sure that, if I'm managing a team, I want to be really aware of what I think maybe some of my team members need as far as technical skills or soft skills, leadership skills that I see that I'm going to share with them, see if they agree to that, and seek some development, or, seeing how they can develop those skills. But more importantly, and I also do that I work with a lot of advisors currently, so not people who report to me from an org chart, structure, but I always want to be in a win-win situation. So I really want to understand what employees have interest in learning, and how, and how I can help them get there. So to me, it's really, again, collaborating around a development plan and taking the time to really have these conversations to understand how, can they develop, and how what their interest is, right? I'm not going to throw them some, trainings or something that don't seem to make sense to them. I also think, I think I shared that with you, Kelly, in a different conversation, but my number one advice is for anybody to develop self-awareness. So I think you need to be aware of your strengths and weaknesses and your style. I have a lot of, once we go into details maybe later on, I have a lot of suggestions on how to do that. But I think what puzzles me sometimes, right, and it's always a journey, like I don't know myself 100%, right, but it's really important to understand, your blind spots, again, strengths and weaknesses, and how you can develop, not necessarily to fix your weaknesses, but just to leverage your strengths sometimes and be even better at what you do. But if you don't have that self-awareness and understand what you like, don't like, and your style, I think a lot of your efforts may be futile if that doesn't work in the end. But so I'm also really big on helping employees understand, what works for them, and who they are really. And it's infusing that psychology into what we do, to me, is very fascinating. It's well beyond the technical skills as I see that.
Thank you so much. I think that makes a lovely transition to Brendan. Brendan, I'd love to hear what employee development means to you and your perspective.
Sure. No, thanks. And that self-awareness aspect was, that was a really good insight. And I do think, my perspective of this has always been a bit of, it's really continuous improvement that invests in your staff, right? So employee development kind of breaks down into two areas where you're balancing that framework of having a support and structure that allows your staff or whoever you're working with to know how to grow and to be able to drive into certain areas, but also gives them enough space to allow for that self-awareness to be flexible and understanding avenues where they want to expand. It ultimately, though, it's a cultural aspect, right? It has to be part of the core culture of an organization in order for it to be successful. And historically, I've seen kind of two different approaches to this. So at one organization I was at, it was taken as a very structured approach. So everyone took a common training to get a common language. They all took Lean Six Sigma training to move through this, and everyone did it regardless of your area. And so it was structured, but then everyone could take that experience and bring that back to their own subject matter expertise or where they work and see how those tools can apply. And so they could develop with this new tool set and apply it in different areas that you couldn't figure out from a top-down approach. Another very successful approach I've seen, though, is where you kind of take it from a pick your own adventure. You have a lot of really talented, smart people at an organization. You get them together, and we had curated courses that were provided by subject matter experts within our organization. And that was opened up to all staff. So it could have been very broad, wide range of topics where that were most likely outside of their normal day-to-day work. But the framework that was put around that allowed the individuals to pick and choose what they wanted to go into, expand a little bit, and then figure out what they liked. And this kind of opened up future paths for them to grow and just give them that flexibility and option to see where they could expand and develop further. But in both cases here, it kind of came back to that core concept of it being a cultural approach. It has to be embedded and consistent across the organization in order for the employees to feel like this is legitimate and has an air of authenticity that they can work with. But you're right, it's a two-way street, as Isabel had mentioned, and it's really getting that, really enabling and empowering employees to kind of grow where they see fit.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I think you both brought really interesting perspectives. And Noah, as I turn it over to you to ask the same question, I can't help but think about your introduction and the fact that you've worked across a wide variety of different styles of organization, and that today in serving as the head of people for an HR tech firm that helps all different kinds of organizations, that perhaps you have a different perspective on this. So would love to hear what employee development means to you.
For sure. And I think I 100% agree with Isabel and Brendan of there needs to be that self-awareness. There needs to be those different frameworks, and it needs to be part of your culture. If it's not part of your cultural DNA, if the founders and the leaders don't live and breathe, employee development and their own self-development, then it just falls on deaf ears, because if your leaders aren't leading by example, then no one's going to think it's important. So I think that's the biggest piece of it. And I think a big part of employee development is feedback, and feedback needs to go two ways, just like what Isabel was saying, is that your leaders need to feel that they can give feedback, but also that the employees can give feedback up. And giving feedback and learning how to give feedback and learning how to get feedback is probably one of the largest markers of success for anyone, because if you can give and get feedback, you're going to grow exponentially. Your development is going to be moving so much quicker than if you get defensive or if you're afraid to give feedback. But there are cultures and there are companies around there where giving feedback is impossible because no one takes it well. People get very defensive and it turns into this toxic culture. I want to talk a little bit about a success story, because when I think about employee development, there's this one standout case in one of the companies that I worked with, where we had this developer who was somewhat self-taught. They did a diploma through one of the local colleges, and from a cultural standpoint, they were a great addition to the organization. But as a developer, they weren't that good, and they didn't really have that self-awareness that Isabel talked about to realize their shortcomings of a developer. And it took their manager and myself to sit them down and be like, look, this is no longer working. Like, as a developer, these areas that we're trying to work on, they're just not seeing results. But we think you could be really successful over here because the skills that we see in you would work really well over here. And it was actually a QA role. And so we're like, why don't you try this? Let's give this 6 months and see how you do here. And they moved into that role. And now they're leading QA for a security firm out here on the West Coast that just was acquired and is exploding. And they're now a leader within their organization. And I still talk to that employee every now and then. And they mentioned that going into QA was probably one of the best things that they ever did in their life, but it had never occurred to them to do that. And so sometimes that self-awareness isn't there with an employee, and it takes the manager to know that person well enough that they say, hey, your skills aren't working here, but I think they'll work really well over here. Let's go on that journey together. And allow that employee to fail at the same time and give them that space to fail and then get up and try again. I think that's a big part of employee development, is allowing for failure as well.
Thank you so much. As we think about the employee development cycle, Brendan, I'm going to come to you first and ask the question up on the screen right now, which is that do you believe employee development is important to organizational success? And if so, why? And I think I heard from all three of you that there's a value of employee development, but I'm curious from your perspective, why? Why is employee development so important?
Right. No, definitely. And yeah, it's absolutely critical. And I think, as you'd mentioned kind of in that preface, that we're moving into a new, an era where we went from services, we're kind of going on to innovation as a driver, right? Well, people are essentially what drive that competitive advantage of an organization. So it really doesn't matter what your market strategy is, if you're going as a cost competitor, or if you're going straight in for being a technical expertise or the leader in whatever that market might be. It's the staff or the individuals in your organization that have to actually make that strategy work. And if they don't have the appropriate knowledge or tools or confidence that comes from a well-supported employee development program, they're not going to be able to execute on that strategy. So, it's something that has to be maintained consistently across that organization in order for you to kind of move forward. Otherwise, you're going to go stagnant. And the other aspect of this, where it's not just in certain areas that this has to be applied, employee development has to be something that is applied consistently across all aspects of the organization. It's kind of that self-fueling engine, right? If employees are getting fully trained, they're realizing new opportunities, they're realizing what options there are that are available to them, they can continue driving that competitive strategy and innovation that's going to help fuel your market growth. But the other side of that is that an organization can't grow on innovation alone. It has to have a structure behind it to support that. So as you're looking at what employee development looks like in your own organization, make sure that it's also applied towards the internal underpinnings that keep that structure running, right? You need to have premium accounting principles, financial and operations, and IT structure. And those individuals need to be enabled and developed just as much as your lead marketers, sales individuals, or R&D and product developers. So yeah, it is absolutely critical. And I mean, it helps drive that engine, keeps it moving forward.
Thanks so much. No, I saw you nodding along as Brendan was talking, so I'm going to send this your way. Why do you feel it's important, and what resonated for you about what Brendan was sharing?
Yeah, I mean, just it's so critical. And if you're not developing your people, they're going to leave. Is the other thing is like, and if you're losing your staff, you're not innovating, because then you're just trying to fill gaps all the time, and it's very expensive. It's not just from a dollars and cents perspective, but from opportunity lost as well. So every time you lose an employee, you're losing out on what could be being built, or what strategy is being implemented, what market segment you could be going after. And so if you're not constantly developing your employees and giving them pathways for success and growth, they're going to leave, and they're going to find an organization that will give them that. And I think another thing there is that development doesn't need to be linear. It can be sideways, backwards, all over the place. I actually just recently came across this great Twitter thread of someone describing employee development as more of a river. It's not a ladder. And so it can go sideways, it curves, it goes all over the place. It can branch into other areas. once you're a developer, you're not always a developer. Once you're in HR operations, you're not always in HR operations. Once you're in customer success, you're not always in customer success. And I think companies need to allow for that growth across different departments. And you also spoke of this with being innovation. Someone in the customer success department may become an amazing product manager because they know what that client needs better than anyone else. And your developer might become an amazing salesperson because they understand the technical requirements of your product better than any salesperson ever could. And so allowing for that employee development across all departments is super important. And I like what Brandon talked about this early on of like kind of the pick and choose your own adventure and allowing employees to build those skills in areas that interest them. And I also want to touch on one thing really quickly of that. There's going to be times when you have an employee who wants to grow in an area and you can't let them grow there, in the fact that like, well, they want to be a director, but you already have a director in that role and you can't fire that director, so that person can step into that role. But helping them develop the skills to become a director at another organization is not a bad thing. Like I call that like good churn, because they're going to leave your organization having an amazing opinion of you. They're going to talk about how amazing that company is to their next employer. Maybe that employer buys your software if you're a SaaS company, or there's junior people at that company who are like, whoa, that's amazing. Maybe I go work over there and grow like that person did. So there's the end all be all isn't keeping people through employee development. I think it's growing people so they can also go be your brand advocates later on in life.
Thanks so much, Noah. Isabel, in your first response, you talked about the value of a win-win, and you mentioned something that's really unique about your position today, which is that today you're leading sort of organizational development in a non-traditional, right, non-hierarchical manner. It's through influence. And so I'd love for you wearing that lens to answer this question and to talk about the role of employee development and how it can benefit organizational success from that perspective.
Yeah, and I will echo what Brandon and Noah said before, on maybe more the technical side. I worked mostly in marketing, the past 20 years until now, and it is a field where everything changes every day. So there was definitely a big need for our teams to also know the latest and greatest related to digital marketing, especially, right? So there is definitely that is kind of, as Brandon and Noah said, like almost a market necessity, because if you don't develop your people and you don't understand what's going on around you, you're going to be irrelevant, or you're not going to be successful. So they definitely, I think that's one reason why development at that level is absolutely a must for your company to succeed. Yeah, I was actually going to touch on what you asked, Kelly, because what's important to me is also fostering creativity and innovation, as also the other panelists mentioned. And I'm a big believer that a lot of creativity and innovation happen when you're not in your traditional environment. So because we all are programmed, right? And I think I was reading that the other day, 99% of our thoughts today were thoughts from yesterday. And we know how hard it is to change and think differently. So I actually try to incorporate, little steps where I can myself at the minimum think differently and be more creative every day. And I remember doing that with my teams too, right? So, a few years ago, we started doing more walking meetings. So instead of sitting at a desk with my employee, I may literally go walk around the block. It may sound a little silly, but I'm a big believer that by changing your environment, your brain starts working differently, and you may start getting different ideas, different ways of solving problems. So to me, really employee development can encompass a lot of things. And if someone walks to me and say, which I did years ago, say to me as a manager, I'm going to need to go swimming 3 times a week at 4 o'clock, I'm going to be like, absolutely, because I can speak of my personal experience. That's always when my best ideas came up. So I think we have to be very, outside the box thinkers to be good leaders, and foster that, agility and creativity of how do we equip ourselves with these skills? Because in this world nowadays, if we're not agile, if we're not able to process change and transition, it's going to be really difficult. So I think development is also helping people, develop these muscles and skills around, evolving in a world that keeps on changing all the time. So I'm definitely all for non-traditional methods to do that.
I love that. And I think many of us have experienced firsthand how a change in environment can change how we work, right? I think in a way that we never could have understood 15 months ago, by virtue of the fact that we're all collaborating now over Zoom, while family pressure is right in our face. We really are learning that there isn't work-life balance as we used to think about it. It's really about alignment, and we have to bring our whole selves to work because we are not able to truly separate from who we were at 6 a.m. when we're at the 10 a.m. meeting. Those two things coexist. So I love that perspective. And Noah, as I come to you, I'd love to understand from your perspective what role you believe employee development plays in organizational innovation, right? We talked about how we can be innovative in our career path, and I loved your river analogy that you shared in thinking about that. But we also heard Brendan touch on how organizations shift, and we heard Isabel mention how sometimes the market shifts what we need to learn, sort of out of necessity of market response. But what role do you believe employee development plays in the organization's identity and how that operates?
Yeah, for sure. And so I think there's two pieces to this. I think one is like the culture of the organization is the makeup of the people that are in it. And so how your employees interact day to day, how they're growing, how they're doing, everything that they do is just a big part of who your organization is and their identity. And, like the founders and the executive team play a big role in that, but ultimately it is the team that shapes the organizational culture. The other piece to that is, I think, by developing your employees and giving them tools and resources to grow in certain ways, whether this is through resilience, which I think is a big thing that we all had to go through when the pandemic hit. If your team is resilient and they have the mental capacity to switch gears quickly and they know how to do that, then they're going to be better able to respond to those market shifts, to respond to the needs of an organization when a new competitor comes into the flow, or to new skills that they need to have, or when a pandemic hits and we all have to start working from home and our world gets turned upside down. So I think there's very key areas that companies are now being forced to help their employees develop, which is in that resilience, in that mental fortitude, in that ability to be able to pivot and change their thought patterns. And like Isabel was touching on just earlier, is like giving them the space to do that. And so like, I need to go for a run at noon every day. Okay, go for that run at noon every day. I understand that you can't have meetings at that time. Or I need to leave at 3 o'clock on these 2 days because I will pick up my kid from school. Okay, that's able to do that. And like on my 15-minute drive to school, I'm going to listen to a podcast, and that's going to help get my creative juices going. And also realizing that employee development looks different for every single person. And by allowing that diversity of thought and that diversity of growth, you're also going to have a more resilient and diverse organization that can respond to different changes within their market, within their retention strategies, within their talent strategies. And so you're seeing all of this right now of like diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge thing now. Head of diversity and inclusion, that wasn't a role 5 years ago, but every company is now trying to hire for those roles now. Head of people wasn't a role 5 years ago, but in the last year, that role has gone up 50% on job boards. And so you're seeing that companies are starting to take their people a lot more seriously. And they're seeing the importance of employee development and how it actually creates resilient and robust organizations who can respond to these market changes. And so I think that is the key there of giving employees the ability to be resilient and change will allow your company to be resilient and change as well.
Great. Isabel, I'm going to come to you next. Would love for you to put on your startup hat and think about the impact world when answering this. What role do you believe employee development plays in organizational innovation?
I think it's a huge part of innovation. I mean, again, I think we touched base a few times here on culture, right? And building a culture that allows for that employee development and innovation creativity to be present. As I work with a lot of, early stage entrepreneurs and enterprises, I definitely see as, one of my mission to really encourage them to think, to create these values and that culture from the very beginning, right? Because we know how, it gets crazy once you start growing, and, things can get a little bit out of control in some organizations. But I think I'm very optimistic, because I think anyway, impact and purpose are a major trend that's here to stay. So I think a lot of companies are now being aware that if they don't think about impact and purpose in their business, they probably will not be as competitive in the next decade. But I do think that, one of your key stakeholders in that impact or purpose work is your employees, right? So, obviously you need your employees to thrive to be the best company out there. So I think that's why, you need to have a clear strategy, just like you may have a strategy with your customers on how you sell your product or your service, being clear on how you're going to address your employees as stakeholders. And in social enterprise world, there are some really cool models out there where, sometimes employees are even, part of, the governance, and, so there are a lot of ways to engage and help people develop. And, some organizations also let people do a lot of different rotations, explore. In the entrepreneurial world, I'm a big fan also of curiosity and exploration. So someone, I think Noah may have alluded to that earlier, someone may be interested in a role or something different. Well, let them try it, they'll find out if it works, if it doesn't work. But I think, and that's what we do in marketing too, right? You experiment, you try something, you realize it works, it doesn't work. I mean, when you're a startup, you have to do that. Otherwise you fail, like they say, fail fast so you can pivot to the next big thing. And I believe the same way with, with people and human development, where it's, experimentation, I would say is highly encouraged. And, don't be afraid of, of trying things, or, if you're unsure, yeah, well, let's see what that means to you. And if you don't try, you won't know, right? So that's kind of my principle too.
That's great. Brendan, as I come to you, I'm going to ask the same question, but I can't help but think about the two paths that you posited in the first question, really the highly structured to create a common language within the culture, Six Sigma kind of training program, versus the pick your own adventure, allow people to choose the training path model. And so I'm curious, of course, what role you believe employee development plays in an organizational innovation capacity. But I'm also curious if you think one of those paths is more effective than another at kind of creating that organizational innovation.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, reiterating obviously what Isabella and Noah said, it's absolutely critical. It's foundational for organizational innovation, right? Employee development has to be there. It's that kind of conduit to allow for change management and other aspects to come through and allow that feedback loop between staff and executive leadership and et cetera to grow. Those two paths I brought up, a lot of my experience is a lot more with mature organizations. And so these organizations have been for a long time, and long time, you're talking either 100 to 40 years or so, and you've got to keep that innovation loop moving through. I personally, and I'm not using this as a cop-out, but I don't think one is better than the other. It has to blend with the culture of the organization. So the organization that had the more structured approach was also a more structured organization, been around for a long time. It had hierarchical norms that are not an easy thing to shift through. It's like moving the Titanic, right? It takes a long time to move through something, or a tanker. So you need to have this structure where everyone is speaking the same language and allow that conversation to come up from employees to drive small, incremental, but noticeable changes. The other side was a culture of a very organic and kind of entrepreneurial, but still long-standing organization, where individuals were really encouraged to identify a passion project, go for it, push it, maybe even compete with others on it to get resources in a friendly way, and then see what kind of fleshes out as a successful model. So that pick your own adventure approach really lended itself well to what the culture was already there and how that worked and how the employees were used to kind of engaging. So, they both work. And I think that's where you have to take that introspective look at your own organization to see what is going to work well with here, because I need to be authentic. And if you're not genuine and authentic with your approach to this one, no one's going to buy in regardless of which model you take. So.
Thank you. I think, Isabel, you started to provide some advice right up front. I'm going to come back to you in the last of our structured questions before we give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions here, and ask what advice you have for company leaders hoping to retain their team. So Noah brought up for us a really growing concern for leaders that we're hearing about. It's being referred to as the Great Resignation. Studies conducted recently by organizations from Harvard to Deloitte are predicting anywhere between 42% and 68% of the workforce are considering making a change, considering making a shift from their existing employer to another employer. And so if you were speaking to a leader of one of those organizations today that's looking around and saying, I know my staff is critical to my organization being able to achieve its objectives and to being able to thrive, what advice would you provide that leader?
I think Brendan said that earlier, the word authenticity, right? So for me, it's, showing up, as an authentic leader who really, walks the talk and create that relationship with your team members on, again, respect, feedback, and that two-way street dimension. So I think you need to create an atmosphere of trust, in order to really, make your team members comfortable about sharing, right? Or asking, because I think we said something earlier, like, oh yeah, I need to, well, okay, empowering people, say, you can leave early, you can do this, you can do that. But a lot of people may not feel comfortable asking because they may think, oh gosh, like they're going to hire somebody else who can be there at their desk all day long. Who knows? You never know. People make so many stories. So I think it's like being able to have a genuine conversation with someone, put yourself at their level really and empathize. That's another big skill, I think, for a leader, is having that empathy to say, I see you, I hear you, I'm listening, I'm asking questions, and let's come up with a plan. And I think, so starting with the conversation and creating that trust, between you and your employees, and really then I think showing, I'm big on making things happen and not just talking too. So then just put something in place, commit to a plan, or some, maybe a few things, 2-3 things to start with, and say, this is it what you need. I completely agree. Or if we don't agree, let's just talk about it, and have even if it's a mini development plan for each of your employees. So everybody has a goal and you are aligned in your expectations, which is another big leadership principle I will mention. Align on expectations, because again, as human beings, we all have all these crazy stories right now running in our heads about what everybody says. So I think it can be very simple. It's just kind of going back to the studs about, how would you deal with the situation with your friend, or maybe with your spouse, or, and somehow at work we behave very differently than we do in our lives for many reasons. But I think, by being more approachable and authentic, you can go a long way, and, and be strategic about it.
Thank you so much. Brendan, you originally brought up that word of authenticity, so we'll come your way and ask what advice you'd share with these leaders.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one thing that everyone needs to remember is it takes a lot of energy for an individual to move to a different organization, right? This isn't something they're doing lightheartedly. It's not something that's an easy aspect at all. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that you need to work with them. You need to have that connection, that authenticity, that empathetic understanding as to why they're willing to invest that energy externally versus internally, and work with them to figure out a framework that they can use that will actually show value and get results to putting that energy internally. It's a matter of really walking the process, right? It's one thing to say that you want to have employee development and have some concepts and structures, but have use cases, test it out, really work with it like you would do any other development or process that you're trying to improve here. Is figure out what the barriers are that individuals are running into, why they feel like they can't make these changes, and break those barriers down. Set the expectation that this will take some time, but show incremental and continual growth or change in the organization that allows them to want to stay there. Because ultimately employees, right, they want to grow, they want to develop into new areas, they want to expand. No one wants to get stagnant, and their growth curves can change over time. So when you talk to them one-on-one and have that open feedback, you can help them realize where it is they want to do, and then divert that effort more towards your own organizational innovation and growth there. So I think it really is kind of getting that conduit or that approach to funnel that effort internally versus externally. But the other side of it, and I do think kind of a callback to what Noah said originally, and I thought it was really brilliant, I hadn't thought about it before, was positive churn, right? In some cases, maybe an employee does make sense to head off to another organization, and you can work with them to funnel that out. I think that was I thought that was really a sharp point to make there. So yeah, hopefully that's one aspect to really kind of bring that energy internal and help them support them.
I love that. Thank you. No, I'm going to come to you with the same exact question.
Definitely. And like, I've talked to a lot of startup founders about this. I talked to my own founders about this. And I've gone through this as a founder myself, is that like your employees need to be able to see the path that they can grow upon. And so there needs to be, like Brandon said, there needs to be some sort of structure. It doesn't have to be overly structured. It doesn't have to be that ladder progression. It doesn't have to be that, but they need to be able to see that there's a future growth perspective there for them as employees. And if they don't see that growth, then they're, like Brendan said, they're going to start funneling that energy outwards to somewhere where they do see that growth. And I think there's a few things that I always tell founders and new entrepreneurs to really consider, is like transparency, over communicating. If you don't think your employees need to hear it, you should probably tell it to them anyways. But being very smart about that communication. You don't want to make them scared. You don't want to be like, oh, we're burning money and I have no idea what I'm doing over the next 6 months. It's talking to them about where the company is going. It's talking to them about the growth, the mission, the goals. It's being authentic as a leader. It's talking about your own failings and how you're learning and growing as an individual as well. It's empowering your managers to have those conversations with their teams so that they can then help them, and putting the frameworks for your managers to have conversations with your frontline employees so that they can grow. And then the managers can also talk to the directors and so on and so forth. And so that there's that multi-step approach to growth and employee development. And I think like the why behind things is really important, because there's going to be feedback and things that your employees ask for and want to do that you just can't do. And instead of saying no, always explain to them the why. Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it that way? Why can't we do it this way? Most times, like 90% of the time, if you tell an employee why you can't do something and it's a real reason, they'll say, okay, I get it. I understand. I'm not going to bring this up again. But if you just say, no, we can't do that because it's hard, then they're like, well, that's not a good reason. That just sounds like you're lazy. But if you tell them like, we don't have the budget for this because this budget's been allocated for this, but if we look at this in Q4, there may be budget for that. So let's talk about it then. And then following up at Q4 and talking to that person about that innovation, that initiative that they wanted. I think that's a big piece. And I think Isabel really talked about this, is like talking to your people, following up with them, making sure that they see the communication happening. There's that feedback loop, and it's a two-way street. I think those are the big things, is you don't want your executive team, your leaders, your managers to be silent on any issue ever, really, in this day and age. There needs to be some sort of dialogue at all points within the organization, or else you're going to start losing people and they're going to be looking for other things.
Thank you all so much. In just a moment, we're going to open it up to audience questions. So if you are listening in on our live audience, you can feel free to add in the chat. But as you were talking, I'm going to posit a question any of the three of you can respond back to. Noah, one of the things you were just mentioning reminded me of something you mentioned earlier that we touched on, which is about the toxic workplace. I think a lot of what we're talking about right now is coming from a place of what we can do moving forward from an okay workplace culture or even a good workplace culture, right? Where we can start to have authentic conversation, where we can use communication as a tool and follow up on it. But what about those organizations that haven't been doing this well, where there is an environment where, you know, they were verbalizing something and then not seeing it follow through. They were allowing somebody an employee development path, but then not actually allowing any kind of lateral movement or structured growth. What do we do in those instances to move forward with employee development and team development as a leader?
I think like there's always going to be toxic workplaces. There's always going to be companies that take advantage of employees, and you're seeing actually, like, not to call it out, but to call it out in the gaming industry, there, you know, you're seeing walkouts at EA, at Blizzard, at Activision, because employees are kind of sick of being taken advantage of, for lack of a better word. And there's always going to be leaders who just won't budge on the way they think that things are going to be done. And my response to that is to employees is to get out of there as fast as you can and find somewhere that will support you in your growth. If a leader in a company realizes that they're on this trajectory for toxic environment and find themselves in a toxic work environment and they don't know how they got there, I think the best thing that they can do is to sit down with the whole team and own that and be like, look, I understand we've come to this point. It's not good. I'm sorry it happened. And it's my fault that it happened as an executive or as the leader of this organization. And I am willing to try and fix this, and I'm going to need some help. And I realize I need to earn your trust back. And so I'm going to do everything I can over the next year to earn your trust back. And so here are multiple ways that you can give anonymous feedback so people can see that they probably won't get penalized for that feedback. And then this is how I'm going to action upon it. And every week I'm going to give a status report, and every month I'm going to give a status report and follow up on all these things. That's if the leader is willing to change. If they're not willing to change, then just get out of there as fast as you can.
That's great. I see a lot of heads nodding. Isabel, do you have a follow-up, or Brendan?
I was wondering if Noah was going to go there. He did, and I'm glad, because, you know, on a personal note, you know, I had breast cancer last year, early stage, and I made it, and it wasn't that, you know, that serious. But you know, what I tell people, you know, people at work, people in my life, is, you know, you learn that kind of experiences that you have no time to waste, and, you know, follow your intuition too. So I think definitely, if you're in a toxic environment, I would say, you know, feel good about bringing up what you need to bring up, having the conversations you need to have. But if nothing, you know, gets through, just go to a place where you're going to thrive. You know, I've had this also personal experience where I knew after a few years in a position, it was probably not the right environment for me. And actually, even people made that comment to me, right? And I still wanted to force it a little bit, or, you know, and I don't have regrets about it, but I knew right inside of me, I'm like, I knew one day I have to leave this place, right? And, you know, then, you know, I went to a different place where I never had that thought for a moment, because I know I'm in, you know, in my flow, I'm really fulfilled in what I do. So, you know, I think it's hard to take that big step, but do not stay in a toxic environment. It's not good for your health. It's not good for anything. So, so I would say, yeah, you know, at some point you got to feel good that you tried, but if it doesn't work, just there are a lot of great companies and great jobs and great people out there.
It's wonderful. Brendan, did you want to add anything to this?
I mean, you know, I do think that it has to be something that wants to be changed at the top down, right? This is if you want to change an organization, all parties have to come to the table to make that change. I mean, you're right. If it's not there, then you have to leave. You have to find something that works best for you, and that organization's going to probably suffer for not making those changes. But if the organization does come to that table and want to make that change, I think one aspect is shining a light on it, right? So and there was mention earlier about transparency and keeping it open, right? And this is where that some of those frameworks that we were talking about can kind of come into play. If it's honest and open and everyone can check it and validate it, then it does help reduce some of that toxicity because it makes it visible and it gives data and justification to where there are concerns. But you can't fix a process if you don't look at it and you're not trying to capture that information. So yeah, it really does come down to that executive leadership to make that transparent and open conversation to drive that change.
That's wonderful. And I think, it comes back to also something that Isabel, you brought up at the beginning, which is a nice transition to a question we received from the audience. You mentioned the value and importance of self-awareness and the role that self-awareness plays. And I think that as leaders, self-awareness happens at the individual level, but it also has to happen on behalf of the company. And so it's also about really not looking at just the aspirational and vision side of your company, but acknowledging and truly taking the effort to discover where the company is today, and then creating the vision for the path forward. And I think as we think about one thing that was mentioned here, which is about leaning into strengths, if you are working for a company where you enjoy your day-to-day role, where you're able to thrive and lean into your strengths, but you don't necessarily see the vision, how do you recommend as an employee bubbling that up? So you mentioned that, Noah, at the beginning, feedback is something we have to learn and grow from. So I'm going to come to you first on this one. Any ideas as an employee, if you like the work you're doing, you're self-aware about what you're doing, how do you bubble it up if you don't think the leadership wants to hear?
I think you find a manager that you trust, or you find an avenue to get that feedback up that might not necessarily come back to you. And I realize that that might not be always the case. There's not, organizations don't always have an honest feedback forums for people to give their own honest feedback. You might not have a manager that you trust to give that feedback and keep your identity anonymous. And you might not have an HR team or a people team to also go to that. And so you kind of have to weigh that risk. Okay, I'm not 100% here. Do I go to the leadership and risk this job that I like, and then, I'm fulfilled and I'm growing and to give this feedback and see what happens? Is there going to be a backlash? Am I going to now be ostracized in my role? Am I going to have to leave the organization? Is it worth that risk to give that feedback, or should I stay quiet and keep doing what I'm doing? Generally, I would recommend to take the risk, because eventually your quality of life as an individual in that role is going to start to go down. No matter how much you like the role, if you don't believe in the vision, if you don't kind of get on board with that, and you need to give that feedback, but you're not able to give that feedback, it's going to bubble up in more and more ways, and you're going to start feeling more and more stagnant, and you're going to start more and more frustrated. And so it's better to realize that earlier on than to let it get to a point where you're like starting to get burnt out or resentful of your organization and your managers. So that's sort of how that would be the advice that I would give.
Thanks so much. Any other thoughts there from either of you?
One area I've seen, and this kind of depends on the size of the organization, but you're likely not alone in that feeling either, right? So if you're happy with your job, but you're not quite seeing the vision, there are probably other individuals that are feeling that way. And we've seen a lot of success in communities and collaboration groups and peer-to-peer kind of work that helps to build that message in almost an anonymous, like pseudo crowdsourced way to bring that up to management, right? So you may be worried about losing your job, but there's 10 to 15 people that are all feeling the same way. They're probably not all going to have that same concern, because there's a certain mass of individuals that can work through that. So it does kind of help to reach out with peers and check that, see, and maybe have that conversation to see, are your concerns, maybe there's just something you're missing too, or maybe you want to learn more about what they might have some perspective on there too. So yeah, again, it depends on the size of the organization. There's enough people to kind of work with and collaborate on, but that's another good avenue if you're not comfortable going direct to management on that.
Thanks so much. Isabel, I'll come to you with any final thoughts on this or anything else as we wrap up our time here today.
No, I mean, I really will echo. I had similar thoughts as Noah and Brandon about finding advocates or, peers who are in the same situation. I know there was a question from Nika in the chat, how we started maybe our careers employee development and what some of the biggest challenge. I think, some of the challenges I've seen is sometimes, right, like we're so busy and we're like, in some jobs you feel like you're running all over the place and, and you don't have time to really pause and think and have these conversations we keep on talking about here. So I think sometimes that is the challenge when you're in very fast-paced environment where you're kind of crossing your fingers every day. I hope everybody is okay, right? Until they are not, and then everything blows up. So you're not doing yourself a favor by not address. It's kind of like in healthcare, right? It's like you want to do prevention so you don't end up in a big crisis. So I see that exactly the same way with employee development, that, it's something that you have to think about doing on a regular basis. So, you can see the fruit of these efforts on a long-term basis. For me, it's like, I was lucky to be in companies and environment where I was able to develop quite a bit as a leader, Guusto training. At some point, I had a personal coach. So there are different ways, depending on what's available to you. But I think these days there's also so much content out there, on the internet, or people you could connect with. As they say, you want to surround yourself with people who can lift you up and inspire you. And I would really encourage you, if there are people, any of us three here, or anybody on LinkedIn who you might be really interested in what they are doing, reach out to them and say, hey, can I spend 30 minutes on a Zoom with you? Like, I love doing that stuff. I've done it for myself too. I've reached out to people because I wanted to get some advice from them. So, there are many ways in our day and age of connecting. And I would say, ask questions, hear from people, see what they recommend you can do. And I think in the end, you'll find some great ideas and, and things you can start doing to do employee development in your organization.
Thank you so much. I want to continue this conversation forever, but I think that's a wonderful place for us to conclude today. If you've taken the time to be here live or to watch this on our YouTube site, it says to me that you're taking the time to invest in your employee development, and you're taking the time, if you're a leader doing this, to invest in your organizational development. And so thank you for that. Keep it up. Thank you to each of our speakers. Your volunteering to be here is a demonstration of your commitment to your community and to the workforce in general. So thank you for making the time to be with us today. Marcy, I'm going to hand it back to you to conclude today's session.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you to our panelists, Noah, Isabel, and Brendan, for taking the time to share your insight and expertise with us today. This was an amazing and valuable session on integrated innovation and employee development. I will be sending a feedback survey in the chat box. And if you can please take this moment to let us know how we can improve our future sessions, that would be awesome. And we will be hosting an event next month, so be on the lookout for our follow-up email where you can find our October event registration along with the replay to this session. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.